Hello today. Based on the community of sensitivity sharing happy listening to everyone, she didn't expect that 3 words would change her entire path. "You're disrespectful," the principal said, eyes cold and voice too loud for the quiet hallway. Ariel stood by her locker, breath hitching, heart squeezing tight, and for those 3 words, she thought she might never breathe again. It was her junior year of high school in a suburban Georgia district. She was a star student, involved in student government, editor of the school paper and president of the debate team. Her grades were solid, her teachers liked her, and everyone knew her as polite, driven, even generous. But today, politeness wasn't enough. Earlier that morning, she had reminded a biology teacher that she'd lost a lab assignment due to a family emergency. When the teacher brushed her off, she replied respectfully but firmly, "I have a note from my mother. I completed the assignment at home." The teacher snapped back, Ariel insisted, and the principal, Mr. Halbrook, was called. Ariel waited, in his office for 20 minutes, curious, tense, replaying every word. Then he said it. "Disrespect." He slammed his door. "You're expelled for showing disrespect to staff." She left his office in tears. No hearing, no alternative, just a phone call to her mother. "Come pick up your daughter, she's expelled." And in that moment, Ariel's world spun. She called her father's cell. He was on a deployment, overseas, serving as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. When he answered, he heard his daughter's heart break. Without hesitating, he promised, "I'm coming home." Within 48 hours, he was back, stepping onto the tarmac in full dress uniform, white cap, navy coat, ribbons neatly pressed, rank pinned with precision. Media cameras began to gather as he walked through the arrivals gate. In moments, reporters swirled around him. He didn't ask for attention. He only asked, "Where is my daughter?" They found Ariel with her mom outside the school gates, her school bag at her feet, her uniform coat loosely buttoned, shoulders shaking. When she saw her father approach in his uniform, something inside her shifted, from broken to seen. She rose, tried to wipe her tears, but he did it for her, gently, without a word. He led her inside the building. Principal Halbrook waited by, his door arms crossed. He seemed confident, until the student body, staff and cameras filled the hallway. Ariel's father, calm and upright, said quietly, "Sir, I'm here to understand what happened." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten. He wore the confidence of a well-trained officer, but spoke as a father. Mr. Halbrook bristled, then scoffed. Said again that Ariel had shown disrespect, and their reputation mattered. Ariel's mother stepped forward, pleading. Her father stood silent, listening. Then he said 3 words that shut down the hallway. "Respect goes 2 ways." Inside the office that would become a turning point, Ariel's father spoke truth. He shared his daughter's grades, community service, teacher recommendations, and that she was not a problem but an asset. He spoke of leadership, discipline, accountability, values he'd taught her in every challenge, every early morning, every deployment return. He said that today those values were being punished. News crews filed in, teachers watched quietly, students snapped photos. He ended by saying, "Expelling her didn't teach her respect, it taught her fear. That's not discipline, that's damage." The school board convened that evening. The outpouring was immediate. Parents, alumni, students all sent letters and signed petitions. Even students who hadn't known Ariel personally showed up. Social media lit up with her story. Many saw themselves in her, the student punished. For speaking up rather than speaking softly, the board overturned the expulsion. Ariel returned to school the next day amid applause. Mr. Halbrook was reprimanded. The district adopted a restorative justice policy, emphasizing dialogue, understanding, and correction over punishment. Ariel found herself on stage at a school assembly weeks later, alongside her father. She spoke from the heart. "I wasn't disrespecting authority. I was speaking truth. I'm not perfect, but I deserve kindness and fairness, and so does every student." Afterward, a line of students approached her and thanked her for being brave. Her father stood back, eyes glistening with pride. He put his hand on her shoulder and said softly, so only she could hear, "You taught them respect today." That was worth more than any uniform. The experience changed them. Ariel learned that discipline isn't about submission, it's about responsibility. That mindfulness means seeing people, not positions. That self-discipline includes speaking with integrity, even when it's risky. And she became an advocate on student panel boards, restorative justice groups, and in student mentor programs. Her father, too, changed. He understood that respect must be mutual, not taken for granted. That authority without empathy becomes abuse. That leadership isn't position, it's presence. A few years later, Ariel began studying education policy in college, hoping to ensure no other student faced what she had. Her journey had begun with expulsion, but ended with purpose. Her father continued his service, but every year he would come home and join her in speaking at school events, sharing their story, not as a caution, but as a call to action. Together, they reminded communities everywhere, respect isn't forced, it's fostered. Discipline isn't inflicted, it's built. And leaders don't teach by silencing, they teach by listening. As you reflect on Ariel and her father's journey, think of the quiet moments, when someone deserves your attention, when someone deserves your respect, when someone deserves to be heard. Because real leadership isn't about setting rules, it's about seeing people in all their complexity and growing together. He didn't plan to become a symbol, he only planned to protect his daughter. But Ariel's father quickly realized this was bigger than her. It was about the silent ones, those students who bit their tongues, lowered their heads, and accepted injustice because no one would show up in uniform for them. In the weeks that followed the incident, Ariel received messages from students all over the country. Some had been suspended for talking back, others for attitude, most of them for simply asking questions. Many of those messages came from students of color, young women especially, who'd felt their voices were too loud for a system that demanded they shrink. Ariel made it her mission to help those voices rise. She began recording short videos on social media, Mindful Minutes with Ariel, where she shared stories of students navigating conflict with authority figures. But she didn't just tell stories. She gave tools: how to self-advocate, how to stay calm when you're angry, how to write a respectful yet assertive letter, how to breathe through tension, and how to speak truth without losing self-respect. One video, titled "The Day They Tried to Silence Me," went viral. In it, Ariel sat in her bedroom holding her old school ID and quietly recounted the day she was expelled. She didn't cry, she didn't rant, she just spoke, clearly, truthfully, and with purpose. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I'm focused. And if you're a student who's been told you don't belong, I want you to know you do. Not because you're perfect, but because you're human." That video crossed state lines, race lines, generational lines. Parents began messaging her too. Teachers reached out. One principal, from a school in Missouri, asked her to speak over Zoom to their student body. She agreed. Then another principal called, then a superintendent. In 6 months, Ariel went from expelled student to a national student advocate, and through it all her father stood by her. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. They became a team, not just father and daughter, but mentor and messenger on. A flight to Washington, D.C., where Ariel had been invited to speak at a youth leadership conference. Her father turned to her mid-air and said something she would carry forever. "You're doing something I never did in uniform," he said. "You're not protecting borders, you're protecting voices." At the conference, Ariel didn't dress in anything flashy, just a simple blazer, natural hair, and a quiet strength. She stood in front of hundreds of students, educators, and policymakers and began, "I was expelled for being too bold. But I was raised to be bold. I was raised to be honest, thoughtful, and strong, and you can be all three and still be misunderstood. That's why we need each other." She spoke of mindfulness, not just as meditation or breathing, but as presence. The ability to pause in conflict and ask, what's the deeper reason this is happening? What are we trying to protect? And is there a better way to respond? She spoke of self-discipline, not just as rules and grades, but as choosing long-term, respect over short-term victory. "Sometimes speaking softer is more powerful than shouting," she said. Sometimes listening is leadership. The audience gave her a standing ovation. After the event, a girl no older than 13 came up to her, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "I got suspended last month because I told my teacher she made me feel small. You made me feel big again." Ariel hugged her. "You were always big, they just couldn't see it." Months turned into years. Ariel published a book at 21, Seen and Heard, A Student's Guide to Self-Respect. It became required. Reading in a few progressive school districts. Her platform grew. She partnered with non-profits. She helped develop student rights guides for schools across the country. But she never stopped being the girl who got expelled, because that pain grounded her. Every time a stage light warmed her face or a crowd leaned in to hear her voice, she remembered sitting in that cold office chair, being told she wasn't worth the conversation. And she turned that memory into a reason to keep going. One winter, her father, now retired from service, joined her on stage at a university panel titled Discipline and Dignity, Bridging Authority and Empathy in Schools. A student in the crowd asked him what it felt like to watch his daughter be punished for doing what he'd taught her to do. He paused for a long time, then said, "It felt like watching the flag fall. But then I watched her raise it again." Hush fell over the room, and in that silence everyone understood that this wasn't just about a girl and her father. It was about a world desperate for balance, between authority and compassion, rules and reason, leadership and listening. Ariel wasn't a politician. She wasn't a teacher, not yet. But she was a leader, in the truest sense. Someone who had walked through injustice, not with vengeance, but with vision. She often told students one simple thing: your story doesn't end at your lowest moment. It begins there. Because hers did. And as long as she had breath in her lungs and people to reach, she would keep telling that story. Not to get applause, but to plant seeds of dignity, awareness, and growth in classrooms, in homes, and in every young mind, learning that speaking up doesn't make you a problem. It makes you powerful. Ariel's journey didn't just transform her. It transformed the very schools that once silenced voices like hers. One day, she received a letter from the very principal who expelled her. It arrived in a plain envelope. No school seal, no formal return address, just a name, Mr. Calhoun. She opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note. "Ariel, I've watched your work. I've seen how you've turned what should have been a closed door into a passageway for others. You changed lives, not by shouting over others, but by listening, teaching, and leading with your heart. I didn't see it back then. I do now. Was wrong. You deserved better. And I'm trying to be better too." Mr. Calhoun, Ariel sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed, deeply, fully. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive in loud declarations. Sometimes it shows up in a quiet letter, long overdue. She didn't respond, not immediately. But she did something better. She invited Mr. Calhoun to a round table she was organizing, a closed-door summit of school administrators, students, and advocates discussing reform. To her surprise, he came. He didn't speak much, but he listened. Really listened, and that, she believed, was the beginning of real change. Eventually, Ariel founded a non-profit called The Second Voice. Its mission was simple: to create space for students who'd been disciplined unfairly to tell their stories, advocate for policy reform, and rebuild their academic lives with dignity. Her team included psychologists, educators, even former school officers who had once been part of the problem and now wanted to be part of the solution. She traveled across states, rural towns, inner cities, suburban districts. Wherever there were stories, Ariel showed up, not as a celebrity but as a listener. She learned that discipline wasn't just a rule issue, it was a relationship issue, and healing those relationships began with empathy. In one school in Mississippi, a 12-year-old boy told her, "They keep telling me I got an attitude, but I'm just tired of being talked down to." Ariel knelt beside him and said, "Then let's help them hear you." Without shouting, "You've got wisdom in you. Let's help them see it." She taught kids how to pause before reacting, how to reflect before responding, not to suppress their truth, but to strengthen it. Mindfulness, she explained, wasn't silence. It was strategic awareness. At one youth summit, a student asked her, "How do you stay calm when everything feels unfair?" Ariel paused, then replied, "I don't always stay calm, but I always stay aware of who I am, what I stand for, and who's watching. Because someone is always watching, someone who might need my courage to find theirs." Years passed. The girl who was once expelled now consulted with education boards and trained teachers in conflict resolution. She still had moments of doubt, moments where she questioned if any of it was enough. But then the letters came, the stories, the emails from students who didn't drop out because they saw her video, from teachers who changed their approach because they read her book, from parents who finally felt seen. Her father never stopped being her compass. He no longer wore the uniform, but his presence remained steady, respectful, grounded. Once, during a long car ride home from a student advocacy event, he turned to her and said, "You changed the battlefield, Ari. You're winning without firing shots." And she was, not because she shouted the loudest, not because she fought the hardest, but because she built bridges where others had built walls. She offered tools where others had only offered punishment. She helped people remember that discipline, when rooted in compassion, doesn't destroy, it guides. She believed that the measure of any school wasn't how it handled its best students, but how it treated the ones who struggled. And for every Ariel who was expelled, there were dozens more who never got to tell their story. So she kept going, one school, one conversation, one voice at a time, because for her, this was never about revenge. It was about restoration. And if a single, young person somewhere in a small classroom could sit a little taller, breathe a little easier, and speak a little freer because of what she built, then every sleepless night, every painful memory, and every closed door was worth it. Ariel's work began to attract international attention. Journalists, education, reformers, even government officials started to take notice. But she never lost touch with the core of her mission, the students, the voices, the invisible stories. One winter morning, she stood in front of a crowded auditorium at a national education summit in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with superintendents, policymakers, and high-ranking officials. Many wore suits and pins. Some carried old prejudices wrapped in new terminology. She walked to the podium in a simple blue dress and sneakers, the same pair she wore the day she was expelled. A quiet statement, a reminder. She didn't read from a teleprompter, she didn't present slides, she simply told a story, her story. She talked about being 15 and being told that she was disrespectful when she asked why her class was reading the same book 3 times while other classes got Shakespeare. She talked about the humiliation of walking through the hallway with her books in a trash bag because no one gave her time to collect them after she was expelled. She talked about the silence in the car ride home, her father's eyes forward, his fists clenched, his heart broken. But then she smiled and talked about what came next. She talked about the night she sat alone in her room and realized she could let this define her, or she could define it. She talked about the first student she mentored, the first school that changed its disciplinary code because of her advocacy, the first time a child told her, "You made me believe I'm not a problem, I'm a person." The room was still. No applause interrupted her, not because they didn't want to, but because they were absorbing every word. Then she said this, "You don't need to fix the whole system today, but you can decide that the next student you see, especially the one who challenges you, deserves to be heard, not just handled." That's where change begins. She walked off stage in silence. The room stood. It wasn't about Ariel becoming a symbol. It was about the truth she carried, truth that echoed through hallways long after she left the building. Months later, she returned to the very school where she was expelled. It had a new principal, new policies, and a mural painted across the wall of the main hallway was an image of a girl standing tall in front of a locked door, her fist raised, not in anger, but in resolve. Next to the image were 5 words, "You cannot silence our voices." She touched the mural gently. Then she turned and walked into the building, not as a guest, not as a former student, but as a speaker, invited by the student body themselves. In That same auditorium where she once sat for detention, students now gathered to hear her speak about restorative justice, about hope, about the power of reclaiming your story. One girl in the front row raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever forgive them?" Gertiel smiled gently. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to carry their actions as your identity. I forgave them when I chose to grow. I forgave them when I showed up. And I forgive them now, because I no longer need their permission to thrive. After the event, a teacher approached her. She looked familiar, older now, but familiar. "I was on the disciplinary board," the teacher said quietly. "I didn't speak up. I should have. I'm sorry." Ariel looked her in the eyes, nodded, and simply replied, "Thank you for saying that. Thank you for showing up now." Because that was Ariel's message. It was never too late to show up, never too late to listen, never too late to begin again. Today, Ariel's story is taught in teacher certification programs. Her non-profit partners with school districts across the country. Her voice, once silenced, is now a guiding light for others navigating darkness. And she's not done, because every time a student is told they're too loud, too emotional, too much, she wants them to remember. They are not too much. They are enough, they are human, and they deserve compassion, not control, support, not suspicion. Her father still sits in the front row of every major event. Now retired, he helps mentor other parents navigating unfair school discipline cases. When asked how he stayed strong during those painful days, he answers simply, "I didn't. I broke a little. But I remembered my duty, not just as an officer, but as a father." And maybe that's what this story is really about, not just the redemption of a student, but the awakening of a system, one voice, one family, one moment at a time. Ariel's journey rippled beyond education. She began speaking at justice reform panels, lending her voice to discussions about juvenile incarceration, school-to-prison pipelines, and the emotional trauma carried by students of color. She wasn't just advocating for change, she was living, proof that change was possible, but with visibility came criticism. Some accused her of exaggerating. Others said she was making educators look bad. In interviews, she was often asked if she hated her old school, if she held grudges, if she ever wished things had gone differently. Her answer never wavered. "I don't wish for a different story," she'd say. "I just wish the system had listened sooner." One day she received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a simple note. "You don't know me, but I was in the hallway that day. I was scared to speak up. I watched what they did to you. I watched your father walk in. I want you to know you changed me. I'm a teacher now. I see my students. Because I finally learned how to listen." Ariel folded the letter slowly and placed it inside a journal she kept, one filled with memories, quotes from students, and quiet victories. She never found out who wrote it, but she didn't need to. Impact rarely announces itself. Years passed. Ariel's name began to appear in books, documentaries, even legislation inspired by her advocacy. But none of that changed her routine. She still visited classrooms. She still took time to write personal letters to students on the edge of expulsion. She still walked into spaces that tried to erase her and left a mark they couldn't ignore. And through it all, her father remained her anchor. There was a moment, years later, that she would never forget. She had just finished a keynote speech at a major national conference on equity in education. As she stepped down from the stage, she saw her father waiting, now with silver in his beard and a softness in his eyes that wasn't there when she was expelled. He pulled her into an embrace, held her tightly and whispered, "They tried to shut you out, baby, but you made them listen." That night, they sat on the hotel balcony under the stars, talking like they used to when she was little. She asked him what it was like, being a man in uniform and a father watching his child suffer injustice. He looked out into the dark and said, "It taught me that wearing a badge means nothing if you can't protect your own. But it also taught me that real justice starts with the courage to stand by truth, even when it hurts." Ariel never forgot those words. Years later, when she launched a mentorship program specifically for children of law enforcement officers who face discipline in schools, she named it the Uniform of Truth. It was her way of bridging two worlds, showing that identity wasn't binary, that one could be a peacekeeper and a disruptor of injustice at the same time. The program grew faster than expected. It uncovered a truth no one wanted to admit. Many officers had children facing the same biases they themselves thought only happened elsewhere. Ariel gave them space to see the contradiction, to reckon with it, to heal. One day, she received a call from the school board of her old district. They invited her to consult on revising their disciplinary policies. At first, she hesitated, not out of spite, but out of fatigue. Going back to the place that hurt you is never simple. But after sitting in silence for a long time, she called them back and said, "I'll come, but only if students are in the room when we talk." And so they were. 15 students, aged 12 to 17, sat beside board members as they reimagined justice in education. Ariel led the conversation, not from authority but from experience. She asked hard questions. She challenged assumptions, and she always brought it back to one truth. If a child disrupts your classroom, ask yourself, what disrupted theirs? First, at the end of the process, the district implemented a new code of conduct that prioritized restorative justice, banned zero-tolerance policies for subjective behavior, and required teacher training on cultural responsiveness. It was a start, and for Ariel, it was a moment of quiet redemption. The media called it Ariel's return, but she called it something else, a full circle that still turns, because in her heart, she knew the fight wasn't over. As long as children were punished for being passionate, for asking questions, for existing loudly, her work would continue, and she reminded others, parents, teachers, leaders, that justice wasn't a moment. It was a mindset. One spring morning, Ariel received an invitation to speak at a graduation ceremony. Not just any graduation, but at the very school that had once expelled her. The new principal, a woman of color herself, had taken over the role after the district's restructuring. In her handwritten letter she wrote, "Your story is our turning point. I want our students to see what resilience looks like. I want them to see you." Ariel sat with the letter for hours before replying. She thought of her younger self, standing in that same building, humiliated and voiceless. She thought of the teacher who had stood silently by, the friends who never looked her in the eye again. But then she thought of her father walking through those doors, of the students who now carried her story as armor. She said yes. On graduation day, she wore a simple white dress and no makeup. Not because she didn't care, but because she wanted to show that you didn't have to polish your scars to be worthy of celebration. As she walked onto the stage, the crowd stood, not because she was famous, but because she had become something far rarer, proof that transformation was possible. She told the graduates a story, her story, but she framed it not as tragedy, not even as triumph, but as testimony. A reminder that every obstacle they would face might just be a mirror asking them to remember who they are. She ended her speech with this: "I used to think power came from shouting louder than those who silenced me, but real power is whispering. Truth when the world expects your silence, and watching the walls tremble anyway." That night a photo went viral. It was Ariel, standing next to the new principal, both women smiling, arms around each other, surrounded by graduates holding signs that read, "We are not disruptions, we are the future." The image struck a chord nationwide, and once again letters poured in, one from a teacher who'd nearly quit after being reprimanded for advocating too hard for a student. One from a teenage girl who had watched Ariel's TED Talk during detention and decided not to drop out. One from a father in uniform who said, "Thank you for showing my daughter she can speak without fear, even if I wasn't taught how." But Ariel wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing healing. In the years that followed, she launched a foundation named after her father's badge number. Its mission: equip schools with tools for conflict resolution, implicit bias training, and youth-led justice councils. She wanted schools to stop punishing children for being different and start preparing them to be powerful. A major turning point came when her foundation was called to consult on a federal initiative designed to overhaul school discipline nationwide. Ariel walked into those rooms, Rooms once closed to her with her usual calm strength. She didn't wear a suit. She didn't speak in academic jargon. She simply told the truth, about how a child's defiance is often their last defense, about how silence can be a survival tactic, not an admission of guilt, about how discipline without dignity is just another form of destruction. And people listened. 1. Senator, moved to tears, said afterward, "We legislate from data, but today I felt the humanity behind the numbers." Still, Ariel remained grounded. She always returned to her community, visited classrooms, answered emails from students at midnight, hosted weekly Zoom calls with families navigating unfair suspensions. She understood what few did, that systems didn't change from the top. They changed from pressure at every level. And perhaps the most powerful moment of all came quietly. At a town hall meeting, a woman stood up and introduced herself as the teacher who once accused Ariel of being aggressive. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I was wrong. I didn't understand what I was doing to you, how my fear became your punishment. I've spent years replaying that moment. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed to say, I see you now." The room was silent, and then Ariel, without hesitation, walked over, hugged her, and whispered, "Thank you. Seeing is where healing begins." That moment, captured by a local journalist, became symbolic of everything Ariel had worked for. Not vengeance, but vision. Not bitterness, but betterment. She continued to teach that lesson to anyone who would listen, that justice isn't about making others feel your pain. It's about transforming pain into purpose. That same year, her father retired. At his farewell ceremony, he asked Ariel to stand beside him. His voice cracked as he said, "I've spent a lifetime serving justice in uniform, but it was my daughter who showed me what justice really means when the uniform comes off." The fee. Crowd applauded, but Ariel's eyes were on her father, the man who once kicked down a school's door because the world refused to listen. The man who had learned, unlearned, and stood beside her, not as an officer, but as a witness to her journey. Later that evening, as they sat on their porch, her father handed her a worn-out badge. The same one he had worn the day he walked into that school years ago. "This belongs to you now," he said. "You've carried the weight of justice longer than I ever did." Ariel took it gently, holding it close to her chest, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that power is not about who speaks the loudest. It's about who dares to speak, even when the world tries to erase their voice. She kept the badge in a glass frame on her desk, not in a place of pride, but of promise. Every time a young person entered her office, scared, dismissed, misunderstood, she would glance at it and remember the girl she once was. The girl no one defended until one man in uniform said, "Not my daughter." And every time, she listened. Not with judgment, but with the kind of presence that says, "You are not the worst thing you've done. You are more than how they label you. You still belong." The work wasn't easy. Ariel faced pushback, school boards uncomfortable with her candor, politicians who accused her of encouraging rebellion, media outlets that twisted her message into sound bites. But Ariel never faltered, because she wasn't working for approval. She was working for transformation, and transformation, she knew, was slow. It required stamina. It required telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. It required walking back into the places that broke you, not to shame them, but to show them how you healed. Years later, one of her foundation's earliest mentees, Lena, a once expelled student now studying law, introduced Ariel at a national education summit. She stood at the podium and said, "Ms. Ariel didn't just help me stay in school. She taught me how to stay in myself, how to stop apologizing for being loud, curious, emotional, alive." The audience rose to their feet. But Ariel didn't walk to the stage like a hero. She walked like a bridge, steady, weathered, and essential. Her speech that night was simple. She told them about the day she got expelled, the shame, the silence, the badge. And then she asked, what if, instead of asking students, "What's wrong with you?" we asked, "What happened to you?" What if every child who walked into school was seen as someone's future, not someone else's threat. The room went still. She continued, "We have the data, we have the policies. But do we have the courage to see every child as worthy of grace, not just discipline?" That became the tagline of her next initiative, "Worthy of Grace." It wasn't a slogan. It was a shift. Soon, schools across the country began implementing her model. Not just revising handbooks, but rewriting the entire culture. Teachers trained to de-escalate, counselors empowered to lead, students invited into decisions that affected them, and the results spoke volumes. Suspension rates plummeted. Graduation rates climbed. But most importantly, students started saying things like, "This is the first time I feel like I matter here. I used to come to school waiting to be punished. Now I come to be seen." Ariel knew the work would never be finished. She wasn't chasing an end. She was nurturing a movement. One evening, she sat alone on her porch, watching the sunset, like she used to with her dad. Her phone buzzed. A message from a teacher in Mississippi. It read, "Today a girl talked back. I wanted to send her out. Instead, I asked her to stay. We talked, I listened, I saw her, and I saw you. Thank you for showing us how." Ariel smiled, because that was the real revolution, not in laws passed or titles earned, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses understanding over reaction, presence over punishment. That's what her father taught her. What she taught herself. What she now taught the world. And so her story, once dismissed, once laughed at, became legend. Not because of the trauma it began with, but because of the transformation it sparked. She never wanted revenge. She never needed apologies. She just wanted people to see, to really, finally see. Because once you truly see someone, past their tone, their hoodie, their resistance, you can't unsee their humanity. Ariel became that mirror, reflecting dignity back to those who'd been denied it. She didn't need a gavel or a badge to do it, just presence, story, and relentless compassion. One day, years after her father passed, she visited his grave. The cemetery was quiet, the wind warm with summer. She knelt, brushing away a leaf. From the carved stone that read, "Captain Elijah Monroe, father, protector, believer," she placed a photo beneath the headstone. A classroom full of students laughing, raising their hands, being loud without fear. On the back, she'd written, "They listened, Daddy. Not just to me, but to the kids like me. The ones you fought for, with your silence and your stare. We're okay now, because of you." A single tear rolled down her cheek, not from sadness, but release. In that moment, she understood that healing isn't loud. It's not a courtroom victory or a viral clip. It's subtle. It happens in policy memos and hallway conversations, and little girls no longer punished for having strong voices. And sometimes healing looks like a daughter whispering thank you to a gravestone. Ariel went on to write a memoir. But she didn't call it My Story. She titled it Because He Walked In, a nod to the moment that changed everything. A father who didn't argue or raise his voice, but simply walked in, uniform shining, eyes steady, and made it clear. My daughter matters. The book became a national bestseller, studied in universities, discussed in teacher trainings, handed out in school board meetings like a guidebook to decency. But Ariel never wanted fame. She wanted change, so she kept showing up, to school gymnasiums and juvenile halls, to podcast mics and council meetings, not to preach, but to ask one question: how? Would this decision change if the kid were yours? And it worked. Over time, systems softened, leaders paused. People remembered, every child is someone's child, and every child is waiting for someone to walk in on their behalf. Even now, when Ariel visits schools, she doesn't demand attention. She walks through the halls like any teacher, observing, listening, and every now and then she sees a student walking out of an office, head low. She stops them. She smiles. She says, "You okay? You want to talk about it?" Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but always they remember the face that saw them, and in a world where so many are punished before they're understood, that face becomes a turning point. That face becomes hope. And years later, when one of those students stands in front of their own classroom, or walks into a courtroom not as a defendant but as a lawyer, or kneels to tie their child's shoes and says, "You are always enough," they remember Ariel, not just what she said, but how she looked at them, how she listened, how she never assumed, because legacies aren't always built in headlines or history books. Sometimes legacies are built in the quiet decision to see someone, fully, freely, and without fear. That was Ariel's choice. Her father had walked into a school to protect her, but she chose to walk into the world to protect others. It wasn't easy. The systems didn't crumble overnight. There were still hard days, ugly headlines, and moments she wanted to give up. But every time she stood before a school board or a judge or a stubborn principal with power and ego, she thought of her father, how he didn't shout, how he didn't threaten. He just stood tall and reminded them without words, "You don't get to define my child." So she kept doing the same, one school at a time, one child at a time. And when people asked her how she stayed strong, how she kept fighting without burning out, she'd smile and say, "I don't fight anymore, I invite. I invite people to remember what it means to be human. I invite them to listen instead of defend, to care more about children than reputations, to choose justice, not just compliance." And then she'd pause, eyes soft. "And when they don't listen, I show them what it looks like when someone finally does." Because Ariel had learned something most people never do. That power isn't in the uniform, it's not in the office or the bench or the badge. Real power is in presence, in being the person who walks in when others walk out, in becoming the voice you wish someone had been for you. So when the documentary team asked her, "What do you want your legacy to be?" she didn't hesitate. She said, "I don't want statues, I want safe schools. I don't need awards. I need every little girl like me to know. Your voice is not too loud. Your hair is not too wild. Your anger is not too much. Your worth is not up for debate. I just want to be the reason one kid doesn't give up." And with that, she stood up from the interview chair, walked out of the frame, back into the real world, back into the fight. And as the cameras faded, the story didn't end. Because stories like Ariel's don't end, they echo in the classroom where the teacher finally asks, "Why did you speak out?" instead of, "Why did you disrupt?" in C. The board meeting where someone finally says, "Let's hear from the students before we vote." In the principal's office where a girl is sent for attitude, and instead of suspension, she's handed a journal and a mentor. That's Ariel's legacy. Not a single moment, but a movement, and all because her father walked in. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with righteous love and unshakable calm. He showed up for her, so she could show up for the world. And so it did. Ariel's presence became a seed planted in the minds of thousands, first through quiet advocacy, then through viral stories shared in living rooms, community meetings, and parent groups. Her story spread not because it was loud, but because it was true. One day, a teacher in Texas paused before writing up a student for defiance. She remembered Ariel's words and chose to sit beside the student instead of standing over her. In Chicago, a school district quietly revised its handbook, removing vague language like disrespect and replacing it with restorative dialogue protocols. In New York, a student who once got expelled for non-compliance became the youngest board member of his school district. And in a small town no one would have noticed, a girl raised her hand in history class and asked, "Why don't we learn about people like her?" The ripple kept moving. Ariel didn't seek credit. She turned down awards, choosing instead to build a non-profit offering legal aid and family support for students unfairly targeted by school discipline systems. It was called Walked In, named after the moment her life changed, not when she was expelled, but when her father walked into that room. Because that's what she believed. We don't need more heroes. We need more people who walk in. People who walk in with truth. People who walk in with courage. People who walk in even when it's not their child, not their problem, not their fight. Ariel's non-profit didn't have fancy offices, but it had power, the kind of power that gets kids back in class, that makes a principal hesitate before punishing a child for being too expressive. That teaches communities how to show up before a lawyer is needed. And quietly, without headlines. She trained parents. She taught them how to advocate in meetings, how to speak in boardrooms without apologizing for their passion, how to remind schools gently and firmly, our children are not threats. They are potential. One day a young father walked into one of Ariel's workshops. He sat in the back, quiet, didn't speak until the very end. And then, when everyone was getting ready to leave, he raised his hand. "I just want to say," he began slowly, voice cracking, "I used to think I had to be loud to protect my daughter, that I had to be angry. But now I realize I just have to be present like your father was." Ariel smiled, her eyes glassy with tears. "That's it," she said softly. "That's everything. Because presence is the greatest protest. Not yelling, not shaming, just showing up fully and refusing to disappear." And as that father walked out of the room, head held higher than when he came in, the cycle continued. Another child would be protected, another school would be watched, another administrator would think twice. All because one man walked into a principal's office in full uniform, not to threaten, but to testify. That his daughter mattered, that her voice was not optional, that silence was not acceptable, and Ariel carried that lesson like armor. She wore it in every courtroom, classroom, and conversation, and when she was asked many years later how change really happens, she answered with the same calm strength her father had once modeled. Change doesn't come when the world finally listens. It comes when we finally stop asking for permission to speak. She paused for a moment after those words, looking out at the small crowd gathered for a local education summit. Many of them were young, new parents, fresh teachers, a few students. They had heard about Ariel, not from the news, but from someone who whispered, "You need to hear her speak." She didn't bring slides, no statistics, just her presence, just truth. Ariel stepped down from the podium and sat on the edge of the stage, speaking now in a softer tone. More like a big sister than a keynote speaker. "You know," she said, "people still ask me what I'd say to that principal today. The one who expelled me. The one who said I was dangerous because I asked a question." She smiled. Not bitterly, not smugly, just at peace. "I'd say thank you. Because that moment gave me clarity. It showed me who I never want to become. It forced me to grow strong before I felt ready. But more than that, it showed my dad who he was too." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ariel nodded, as if to say, "Yes, lean in. This is the part that matters. My father taught me that the uniform doesn't give you strength. It just gives you visibility. The real power comes from what you do when people are watching, and more importantly, what you do when they're not." She stood up again, this time not behind the microphone, just her voice in a room of people, who were no longer strangers but witnesses. "I was a child when they called me a problem, but I chose not to become one. I chose to become the solution instead. And you can too." There was silence, the kind that feels holy, like something deep just shifted. Then someone stood, a mother. She held her child's hand. She didn't say much. Just, "Thank you for helping me remember that my daughter's voice isn't too loud. It's just powerful." Ariel nodded. Walked down, hugged the woman like they'd known each other forever. Because in a way they had. Every parent who has fought for their child knows that battle. Every student who has been silenced knows that pain. And now, because of Ariel, they also knew the path forward. It didn't require fame, it didn't require wealth, it only required presence, consistency, love. That was how movements began. Not in marches or riots, but in meetings, in conversations, in decisions made quietly behind school desks and courtroom doors. The media didn't always cover it. But change was happening. One expulsion overturned, one policy rewritten, one teacher retrained, and a million small victories that no headline would ever print. But Ariel didn't need headlines. She just needed truth. And every time someone else stood up, especially the quiet ones, she knew. The story was far from over. It was only just beginning. She didn't expect the invitation that arrived a few weeks later. It was a plain envelope, no gold seal, no special lettering, just her name. Handwritten neatly, Ariel Thompson. Inside, a short note. We're revising the district student conduct policy. We'd like your perspective at the table. Board of Education. She stared at it for a long time. Not because she didn't believe it, though a year ago she would have laughed it off, but because somehow the system that once silenced her now wanted to listen. Not performatively, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. She showed up to that meeting in the same blazer she wore at her college graduation. She remembered her father adjusting the shoulders before the ceremony, smiling at her with that proud, quiet look only a dad can wear. Now she walked into a room where policy had once been weaponized against her. Only this time she was the weapon, of truth, of compassion, of lived experience. The room wasn't welcoming at first. Some saw her as just a student, others saw her as a disruption. But Ariel had learned how to stand in that space. She didn't flinch, she didn't rush, she just spoke. When I was expelled, she began, no one asked me why I questioned authority, no one asked what was happening at home or if I felt safe in school. They saw defiance, not distress. They saw attitude, not anxiety. But you can't fix what you refuse to understand. That line landed like thunder. Quiet, heavy, undeniable. One board member, an older man who had been teaching before Ariel was born, removed his glasses and looked at her, not with defensiveness, but reflection. And that's when she knew it was working. The meeting went long. The revisions were tough, but her voice didn't waver once. She proposed changes to the language used in write-ups, removing vague terms like disrespect and requiring concrete descriptions of behavior. She pushed for student advocates in disciplinary hearings. She insisted on trauma-informed training for teachers and staff. Some of it passed that night. Some would take months, but seeds were planted. Real ones. Afterward, as the room emptied out, that same board member stopped her. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said. "Smart, outspoken. She got suspended last year for wearing a shirt with the word resist on it. I didn't say much then. Thought maybe the school was right. But listening to you tonight, I think I owe her an apology." Ariel didn't smile. She just nodded. That was enough. Later that week, her father found her in the kitchen typing furiously. "What's all this?" he asked, peering at her screen. "Scholarship essay?" she replied. "They asked me to write about a moment that changed my life." He raised an eyebrow. "You writing about that day in the principal's office?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm writing about after that, about when I learned I could change someone else's life instead." Her father didn't say anything, just walked over, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You already have." College was supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate, and in many ways it was. Ariel stepped onto campus with a quiet confidence. No one here knew about the expulsion. No one whispered about the girl with the attitude. But she carried that experience like a hidden scar, not out of shame but as a reminder. Her first semester she majored in political science. It made sense: laws, systems, power. She wanted to understand the mechanics behind decisions that broke lives and reshaped them. But what she didn't expect was how lonely the journey would feel at first. She'd walk past the bustling quad, watching students gather in study groups or play frisbee or laugh without fear. And she'd feel outside of it, like she had grown up a little too fast, until she met Camille. Camille was loud, brilliant, and unafraid to challenge professors mid-lecture. She wore a denim jacket with patches that read, "Question everything" and "Black futures matter." The first time Ariel saw her, Camille was organizing a sit-in for housing rights on campus. By the end of the week, they were inseparable. "You've got the receipts," Camille told her one night over late-night waffles. "You've been through it, that's your superpower." Ariel laughed. "Feels more like a weight." "Same thing," Camille said. "Depends how you carry it." That fall, a freshman in their dorm was detained by campus security after being mistaken for a theft suspect, all because he matched a vague description. Black male, athletic build. The student had been carrying a textbook and a half-eaten granola bar. No stolen property, no explanation, no apology. Camille was furious. Ariel was quiet, but not passive. They drafted an open letter. collected signatures, demanded transparency from the university's safety office. And when the administration responded with silence, they took it to the campus paper. Ariel's words were everywhere. "We are not your shadows. We are not your suspects. We are students, and we belong here." The article sparked campus-wide debate. Some called them radical. Others said they were stirring up trouble. But the noise didn't bother Ariel, not anymore. She was used to being called disruptive. What mattered were the dozens of students who emailed her afterward, sharing their own stories, some heartbreaking, some empowering, all real. One day, she received a message that stopped her cold. It was from a professor she didn't know. "Just a short note. Read your article, thank you. My daughter was suspended in high school for defiance. Your words helped me understand what I missed as a parent." Ariel sat with that email for a long time, because sometimes justice doesn't come with thunder or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a door that was once locked slowly opening. By the time Ariel entered her junior year, she had become the youngest member on the student advisory board. She led forums, facilitated workshops on bias in education, and began mentoring incoming freshmen. But even with her accomplishments, imposter syndrome crept in like a shadow. At a leadership retreat, she broke down during a group session. "I feel like I'm always trying to prove I belong," she confessed. "Even when I'm invited in, I wonder if it's just to check a box." The room was still for a moment. Then a faculty member, a black woman in her 50s, leaned forward. "Ariel," she said gently, "your presence is not a checkbox. It's a blueprint." That stayed with her. Years later, Ariel would graduate summa cum laude. She'd give a speech that had half the auditorium in tears. She didn't talk about awards or internships. She talked about silence and how breaking it changed her life. "There was a time," she said, "when my voice was treated like a threat. But I learned that it's actually a torch, and when you hold a torch, you light the way for others." Went Guy. The applause faded. She stepped off the stage and found her father waiting near the stairs. Same uniform, same proud smile. "I told you they'd listen someday," he said. She hugged him tight. "They didn't just listen, Dad. They changed."